My name is Jamie Williamson. I'm the Executive Director of the International Code of Conduct Association, based here in Switzerland, Geneva. And I've got the privilege of moderating what should be a fascinating panel. We have 5 great speakers that I'll introduce in a few seconds. But before then, maybe introduce the subject matter of the webinar and the kinds of issues that we want to discuss and unpack in the hour or so that we have together. As most of you should know by now, this month marks the 10th anniversary of the UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, also known, I think, colloquially as the UNGPs in many sort of documents and environments. The UNGPs are very much sort of the framework around which the International Code of Conduct Association, as well as the Code of Conduct itself, were developed over the past years. And a large part of our work is part of the implementation of the UN Guiding Principles in a sort of sector specific environment. The private security sector marked its 10th anniversary, as I mentioned earlier, as a sector specific implementation tool of the UNGPs. We're marking the 10th anniversary of the UNGPs by releasing our own guidance on human rights impact assessment, HRIA, for private security providers. And we'll touch upon the content and development of this particular tool during this webinar. As part of this launch, but also to mark the 10th anniversary of the UNGPs, we've put together this panel of experts to reflect on how the arena of business and human rights has evolved in the last 10 years. And how the private security sector in particular fits into this, and what being a responsible business operating in complex environments entails. Among some of the questions panelists will consider as part of the webinar today will be how this process is complicated for businesses with operations in complex environments. What developments do we see on the horizon that might influence the direction of the UNGPs in the decade ahead? And of course, how will this impact on the private security industry? And then what progress has been made in applying the UNGPs to the private security industry, and what tools are available to assist companies in conducting rigorous human rights due diligence in fragile contexts. And finally, why is rigorous human rights impact assessment a fundamental foundation stone for effective human rights due diligence? To help us navigate these and other questions, we are joined by 5 great panelists. I won't go through their extensive bios, which speak for themselves, but introduce them as each speaks. But before doing so, maybe note the background and where each of our panelists comes from. The first speaker would be Anita Ramasastry, and it's good, Anita, to see you back here in Geneva, who's a Henry M. Jackson Professor of Law, School of Law at the University of Washington, and a member of the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights. I need to thank you for being with us. I know there's a parallel event going on with some of your colleagues, so it's great to see that the working group is sharing its resources across different webinars. Our second speaker will be Dorothee Baumann-Pauly, who is Professor and Director at the Geneva Center for Business and Human Rights, the Geneva School of Economics and Management at the Geneva University, and a Research Director at the Center for Business and Human Rights, Stern School of Business, New York University. Dorothee, it's a pleasure to meet you, albeit virtually at this stage. John Bray, the next speaker. He's a Director with Control Risks, an ICoCA member company. Thereafter, Giuseppe Scirocco, Monitoring Officer with the International Code of Conduct Association and the lead author of the association's Human Rights Impact Assessment tool, will be taking the floor. And last but not least, Rebecca DeWinter-Schmitt, an ICoCA observer and presently an Associate Program Director at the Investor Alliance for Human Rights, will try to capture what many of our speakers have said and bring on a different set of expertise to the discussions vis-à-vis private security companies, human rights due diligence, and issues linked to the investor world in particular. I won't speak much more because we have 5 great speakers. So I'll turn first to you, Anita, if I may. Oh, I need to pause for a second. I need to indicate, of course, we have interpretation in English, French, and Spanish, English being the main language of the panel. For those of you who need interpretation, there is an icon at the bottom of the screen. Click onto that and it's fairly self-explanatory. If you have any questions, please put them in the Q&A and we'll try to address them during the course of the webinar. So Anita, going back to you, if I may. We're marking the 10th sort of anniversary of the UNGPs. and heightened due diligence in complex environments. I've also been reading, with quite some interest, the document that your team and yourself have put together on the guiding principles on business and human rights at 10, taking stock of the first decade. I must say it was a fascinating document, and I don't think you sort of were too diplomatic in some areas, very positive, but also very critical, and hopefully also quite pragmatic in terms of the way forward. So could I open the floor for this webinar and give you the opportunity to, one, speak a little bit about the taking stock aspect. How have we evolved over the last 10 years? And what should we expect over the next 10 years? And then given that we're very much focusing on the private security sector as well, to what extent is the association and the code relevant to UNGP implementation mechanisms? Anita, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Jamie. And it is an honor to be here with friends and colleagues on this panel to talk about the importance of ICoCA and its work in this larger universe on the 10th anniversary of the Guiding Principles. The working group, to commemorate the 10th anniversary, did take a look back and took stock of where have we come after a decade. And that's the report Jamie's referring to. I'll put a link in the chat. And of course, there's an executive summary for those of you who don't want to wade through a UN report. But the larger, I think, good news is that after a decade, as my colleague Dante Pesce, our chair, says, is that you could look at the glass as being half empty or half full in terms of what progress we've made in terms of business and human rights, and really promoting respect for rights holders, people impacted. That's the goal. That we have made progress, and some say not enough, but we are speaking a much more common language, and I'll get to why I think that's important in reference to ICoCA in a minute. But the real issue is that we are all using a common framework, a common language, and sort of ideas and approaches. We've seen the embedding of the guiding principles in sort of key multilateral places, such as the OECD guidelines. We've seen them used by regional bodies. We've seen them used by the private sector. So it's really great to see the way in which this framework has evolved, and that our report really focuses on that we've seen through national action plans on business and human rights, commitments by states throughout the world, all continents, all regions. We've seen what we call regional races to the top and peer learning by states. We've seen different sectors embrace the guiding principle. So all of this is good, right? To say that the socialization period, this decade, has been what's happened. What the report also says, though, is that right now is the time for better metrics of measuring impact. Really have the guiding principles, now that we have a common framework, actually made measurable progress in terms of improving people's lives. And that's the challenge for the next decade, as well as pushing beyond paper into that real practice. The other thing I think that's been unprecedented, and again, I think it's really useful to think about ICoCA's guidance today, is that the pace at which we move from a purely voluntary universe in terms of what companies needed to do into this new mandatory world, especially in Europe, as we look at mandatory human rights due diligence, is actually quite remarkable. I think 10 years ago, I would never have imagined that we would have the number of jurisdictions, as well as the European Union, contemplating and debating these issues. And of course, that will have an effect outside of Europe as we look at trade relations and people that are, or companies, I'm sorry, that are doing business into European markets. So I think, again, that is important. So progress, socialization, a move from voluntary to mandatory, but we need much more in terms of implementation. And as we've seen, states are not yet coherent in terms of thinking about their agendas on human rights on the one hand and their economic policies in trade and investment. But as we reflect on all of this, I lead the working group's work focusing on business human rights, and we would say conflict, but of course complex environments more generally. And of course we have observed around the world many complex environments through our country visits and missions. Again, many continents, many countries, where we hold ICoCA out as a great model of dealing with a particular sort of industry that needs to deal with complex environments. And what we see is the hallmarks of what the guiding principles recommend as sort of is key good practice. One is multi-stakeholderism, the involvement of government, civil society, and the private sector developing common and shared frameworks together, which we believe is still very, very important to this. And some challenge multi-stakeholderism, but the working group has really come forward and said that this is important. And multi-stakeholder initiatives allow you to move across governance gaps quickly, nimbly, and to address problems where regulation and legislation and, of course, treaties will take much longer. So that flexibility, I think, is very important. The second is really commendable, the idea that ICoCA has used the guiding principles as a base to then develop its own contextual frameworks. You've taken on operational level grievance mechanisms. Today you are launching guidance on human rights impact assessments. You have focused on the concept of human rights due diligence, but again applied it to the private military and security sector, right? So to me and the working group, this is what's very important. And we highlighted this, highlighted this in our country reports, but we highlighted it in our report on business, human rights, and conflict affected areas, where we talk about heightened due diligence and heightened action. And we point to what you have accomplished, I think, as examples. So multi-stakeholderism, focusing on guiding principle frameworks, and then the core concept of human rights due diligence. I think all of this is incredibly important. And I'll stop there and say I really look forward to hearing the reflections of the other panelists.
Thank you very much, Nita. And so I'll take that mixed bag of the progress in a sort of very positive sense in terms of where we have come. But also I think that reality check that we have seen a certain level of progress, but now it's always that challenging part in terms of the what next, the implementation phase, and ensuring that all the key stakeholders come to the table. I'll certainly come back to you on some of the issues you've mentioned and some of the content of the report. I think maybe later on we might want to talk also about the national action plans and how positive are we vis-a-vis those that have, in terms of states that have adopted national action plans, but I think also recognition that maybe more still needs to be done by states in that regard and governments to show some level of leadership in some regions with the UNGPs. Thank you very much, Anita. Dorothy, if I may turn to you now. Very much sort of building sort of on the sort of what Anita's been speaking to, and very much looking at the question of the capacity in corporate practice. And reflection on your part on the UNGPs and what are the effective strategies to advance human rights in corporate practice, because they seem to be uncomfortable bedfellows, sort of the human rights world and sort of corporate governance issues. And then from your specific perspective, how's the Geneva Center engaging with companies to advance human rights due diligence practices? And then the importance of training, maybe, if you have time in those 5 minutes, and how could this be implemented through a multi-stakeholder approach? Dorothea, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Jamie. And thanks to the ICoCA team for inviting me to today's event and to share a few reflections on the forward-looking and action-oriented next decade of the UN Guiding Principles. Also, thanks to Anita for your great initial overview of the status quo. It'll make it easy on in my remarks. To add that for business human rights, at both institutions, we conduct research to challenge rights. So our work is focused on the challenges that affect the daily corporate practice. And of ICoCA as a multi-stakeholder initiative that clarified in concrete terms the human rights expectations of private security service providers. And in so doing, the ICoCA code gives meaning to a company's commitment to the UN Guiding Principles and its central concept, human rights due diligence. And it's great to hear that the working group also upholds ICoCA as a model for through which human rights due diligence can be developed. We think this is important because even after 10 years, the meaning of human rights due diligence is not so clear to many companies. After all, human rights challenges differ in each industry context, and clarifying what companies are actually committing to when they say they align with the UN Guiding Principles is really important. So for security service providers, ICoCA defined human rights standards in its code. Yet to make these codified human rights expectations actionable, they need to be operationalized even further. They need to be broken down into metrics and into means of evaluation. And essentially, each code element needs to become measurable so that we can assess compliance with the code, but also progress over time. And to get there, it's important to test draft metrics and means of evaluation in the field. For ICoCA, the definition of indicators for specific code elements has started, but it's not yet completed and should continue. To close the loop, ICoCA's members also need to ensure that these high-level commitments at the top of corporate hierarchies trickle down to each and every employee. Companies need to roll out training programs that prepare security providers for how they are expected to conduct their jobs every day. Particularly for employees that provide security in complex environments, efforts must be made to build capacity for responsible conduct, even in difficult and rapidly changing contexts. One great advantage of a multi-stakeholder initiative is that they can pool knowledge and also resources through their platforms. This means that training materials could be developed jointly for all their members. I congratulate you on developing the guidance for impact assessments. I think that's a great start. So in this broader context, the Geneva Center is currently working with the ICRC and DCAF on revising a knowledge hub for companies that operate in complex environments. We will launch the revised toolkit in the Knowledge Hub just after the summer, and some of the resources in there might be a helpful start for ICoCA members as well. I concur with Anita. Over the next decades, the UN Guiding Principles will need to prove that they affect actual company conduct and that engaging in human rights due diligence yields positive impacts for workers and communities. Defining the concrete meaning of human rights due diligence industry by industry is therefore a necessary next step. For private security providers, ICoCA is the ideal platform to advance human rights in their industry, and its work deserves further support and strengthening as a sector-specific implementation tool for the UN Guiding Principles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dorothy, and for your words of support as well, I dare say. But I think what I would like to note definitely from what you said, and I think it goes back to points that Anita made as well, and we've seen it through our work. It's that term, it's nice to have the commitments, but then how do you translate those commitments into operational realities? And then how do you actually unpack those commitments into something which is pragmatically understandable by the stakeholders that have to apply, whether it's the co-provisions, as they have been developed into indicators as well, metrics, but also more broadly speaking, the UNGPs, because they're quite high level at many levels, many areas. And I think for us, the challenge is, okay, when you're working with companies way down the supply chain in those high risk environments and complex environments, how do you have them understand what they need to do vis-a-vis the UNGPs and then the code specifically when we're looking at security companies? And so maybe this is where I'm going to bring in John to speak about the sector as well. Because of course, quite a lot of what we hear in the whole UNGP world and on the code is very much a focus towards the responsibilities of certain sectors, here specifically the security sector. And we're seeing major questions being addressed vis-a-vis states, but I think also the corporate world in terms of human rights due diligence, the potential for new legislation out there. We're also seeing some elements of corporate accountability come into the fore, presently very much in the civil realm, potentially in the criminal realm in a few days from now. And the question I would have is, how does the industry, and you work with Control Risks, a major international player, a security contractor as well, one of our members, how are you managing and adapting to these kinds of requirements and obligations? And how can the industry also lead by example rather than being told to sort of toe the line each time on human rights due diligence and other such requirements? John, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Jamie. And thank you to Dorothy and Anita for the excellent beginnings. Just to introduce Control Risks, we're a global risk management company. We work across a range of sectors. I work heavily on policy. We also have people very much on the front line of complex environments, such as Iraq and such as Mozambique. First points, of course, are, again, to repeat the endorsement, we were among the founder members of ICoCA. We continue to very much value the relationship. We very much endorse the point about multi-stakeholders. And we think that individual companies have their own responsibilities, but actual solutions, broader solutions must come from multi-stakeholders. So then some perspectives on the guidance and on how we hope to apply it, or how we already are applying some of the points. Starting point, I'm a policy person. I see on page 11, and Giuseppe will know this by heart, I see it says rather diffidently that companies might think of having a human rights policy. I think that's so polite, but I wouldn't say might think. They must have a human rights policy. Of course they must. Second point, I want to enlarge on some of the key relationships which companies like ours must have, and how human rights plays out in that. Our key relations, of course, go in all sorts of directions. They're rights holders in this topic, but they're also our clients. So the relationship starts when we're bidding for contracts, when we're seeking work. And on a note of realism, I would have to say, how do we get our work? Price is important, technical expertise is important. It is a commercial relationship. I don't want to downplay that. But then in this context, I do also want to say that human rights is very much part of that, and it's more and more part of it. You've mentioned legislation. That's, I guess, something that we are saying to clients more than the clients are saying to us. We are saying to clients, wake up, this legislation is coming. But it is coming, and it is part of the equation. Also important, and I think this is looking ahead to Rebecca, is the investor viewpoint. Particularly this year, we're hearing more and more about ESG. This is investor language, environmental, social, and governance. Human rights is part of governance. Going on then, on the project relationship, I would also say this goes two ways. We need to satisfy our clients that we think about human rights. It is also reciprocal. We need to evaluate whether we want to work with certain clients, certain projects. We sometimes have quite robust discussions. We actually have a high risk threshold where control risks, we like taking risks, but we do turn projects down. Then a little bit on the dynamics of the relationship at the operational level. Two key themes I want to stress. Project owners own project. Our clients are the project owners. They are responsible for the key decisions, the strategic decisions. On the other hand, our colleagues, are often the public face of complex projects in, for example, Iraq. We're the public face in the sense that the security guys are often the people that communities meet on the ground. That means that for us, obviously, community relations are really important. Community liaison is part of where we can play a key role. And we can help our clients, but it's ultimately the clients who make the decisions. So here I want maybe to enlarge on a point or offer it as a challenge for implementation. The risk assessment, we are responsible for our own risk assessment. Our clients are responsible for their risk assessment, but basically it doesn't make sense to do them separately. It needs to be a holistic exercise from the beginning and also in monitoring, basically as the project develops, because this whole business is a dynamic process. It's not one risk assessment and then you forget about it. It's a baseline risk assessment, but the project changed things. We are together part of the story. So it's this togetherness that I want to emphasize as a key point. The multi-stakeholders, it's government, it's NGOs, but it's our clients. They need to be part of this too. They need to be built into implementation. I guess a final point, we've just heard about the report issued in June. As part of my preparation, I did also look at the earlier working group report on business in conflict settings. And it reminds me of many discussions over the years. Key points I want to make. No country is going to recover from conflict without the private sector. But as the report also says, private sector can do good and bad. In order to do good, we need good practice. The guiding principles are definitely part of that. The security sector is part of that because we are enablers. We help people operate in difficult environments, but we have to do our part. I think it's quite a small part, but I also think it's quite a critical part. And through guidance such as this, through collective initiatives, I hope that we play our part. And thank you.
Thank you very much, John. And again, plenty in those 5 minutes to unpack. I think the point I'll take from that, clearly there's a need to have human rights policies, but again, the implementation piece is crucial. And the fact that you already start speaking about the responsibility of clients as well, of how do you engage clients, goes back to that discussion we see quite often coming up in this arena. It's a whole supply chain of how do you bring all the actors along that supply chain to take their responsibilities in a holistic and sort of collective sense, because the more diffuse the supply chain, the higher the risks potentially as well. And I think what's also quite interesting on that private security piece in terms of the economic footprint that they also often. Most of the discussions in the early days about the whole sort of the private sector in complex environments, quite often the private security piece was not seen as an employer in any sense or an economic player in many of those environments. They were simply seen as a service provider. But if you look at the data out there, it is clear that in complex environments, private security providers are major employers and major economic players as well. So maybe we should look at them less as pure service providers, but also a corporate entity in their own right with their own responsibilities. But we'll get back to that, no doubt, and a few of those issues, John, afterwards. Thanks for that. Giuseppe, I'm going to turn to you now, and we can sort of bring it down to a bit more sort of granularity on the sort of the human rights impact assessment guidance that we have just developed. And, a couple of questions in terms of course the process and why we sort of decided to go ahead with this particular document. Maybe distinguishing, I dare say, because quite often we have that question about a risk assessment and an impact assessment kind of discussion. Why have we worked on the sort of human rights impact assessment and not a risk assessment, and the difference thereon? And the challenges and next steps. It's great to have a guidance, but then what do we do with it going forward? Giuseppe, lead author on this study and guidance, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jamie. Just to answer your first question on why we decided to develop a guidance on human rights impact assessments. Well, if we look at the International Code of Conduct, and in particular paragraph 6D, we see that it requires all ICoCA member and affiliate companies to identify, assess, and address adverse effects on human rights, adverse impacts. Over the years, we had received requests from companies to provide education and support on this aspect and on human rights due diligence more broadly. And as you were alluding to, we, when analyzing some of the methodologies, human rights due diligence methodologies that companies had submitted, we noticed that there was a certain confusion between assessing risks to the business and assessing impacts on people. And that's why we have decided to draw that distinction in the guidance between risk assessments and human rights impact assessments, even if we know that this distinction is not uniformly adopted across sectors, but it's exactly for the purpose of underscoring that the fundamental objective of human rights due diligence is assessing impacts on people rather than risks to the business. There are, of course, useful resources available on human rights due diligence and on human rights impact assessments. However, what we have seen is that there is no resource available, or there was no resource available, specifically focusing on the impact of private security companies and providing recommendations tailored to the industry. So the purpose of this exercise, of this guidance development, was to bring some clarity on some of these aspects, and to help companies to get an understanding of human rights due diligence and topics on which not all of them might have expertise. This is also, I think, an interesting time to publish such a guidance because of the mandatory human rights due diligence discussions that are currently taking place and that have already been referenced. From these discussions, we might see the adoption of new requirements, in particular in terms of reporting. The guidance has been developed through a multi-stakeholder process in line with the nature of ICoCA and initiative. This means mostly consulting with companies through a survey, through bilateral calls, through the analysis of certification material that has been submitted for the purpose of ICoCA certification, as well as engagement with subject matter experts, and some of them are on this call today, and review of available literature, of course. What I would like to underscore here is that, of course, we have not tried to reinvent the wheel. We have relied on existing resources, but we have tried to tailor some of the recommendations to the realities of the private security industry. And you would see that the guidance starts with an introduction to human rights and human rights due diligence, as human rights due diligence is intended in the UNGPs. And this for the purpose of familiarizing companies, all companies, or even smaller companies, to these concepts. It then clarifies what is the purpose of conducting human rights impact assessments, again, focusing on impact on people rather than risks to the business. And then it articulates the phases of human rights impact assessments using a model that has already been proposed and adopted by other organizations, but again, integrating some considerations specific to the private security industry. And then I think your last question was on challenges and next steps. I think there are different challenges, but these are all somehow connected to each other. The first challenge is the dedicated capacity and human rights expertise that human rights due diligence and human rights impact assessments require. And I think this was recognized also by the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights in its recent report, stock-taking report on the 10 years of the UNGPs. And I will quote here where it says that meeting the full expectations set out in the guiding principles is a complex and ongoing task, particularly where the activities of business relationships connect to conflict-affected areas, as in the case of many private security providers, which requires heightened due diligence. The fact that these capacities might be lacking, especially in smaller companies, means that it might be needed additional support from ICoCA to facilitate the understanding and implementation of the recommendations included in the guidance. The second challenge, which is connected to the previous one, is the operationalization of the guidance. We know that publishing a guidance is not going per se to help companies improve their processes and practices unless there is dedicated follow-up and implementation of the guidance. And again, we might need to engage companies bilaterally to raise awareness, to facilitate understanding, and to build their capacities. Finally, the last challenge is about the fact that the human rights due diligence one is an evolving field. We have new national laws, regulations that are specifying an increasing number of reporting requirements. And we need to make sure that all ICoCA member and affiliate companies are ready to meet these expectations, not only of regulators, but also of clients and of investors. That's why we mention in the guidance that this is a living document. We might update it over time as new regulations are being adopted, as new trends emerge within the private security industry and beyond. So this is just a very brief summary of what I believe are the main challenges. Over to you, Jamie.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. And I'll definitely take a note there in terms of the next stage. And again, it goes back to the implementation discussion going forward. We have the guidance, a tool specifically for private security providers. We have the distinction between the impact on communities and the risks to companies. And then the question is, how do we blend those? And then how does this also work its way back upstream as part of the broader human rights due diligence sort of initiatives out there? Rebecca, last but not least, thank you very much for your patience, but hopefully as a last speaker, you've heard quite a lot of material there from the previous speakers. And you come from a quite privileged position, I dare say, because you have been working extensively on the sort of human rights and business world for a number of years. You've been quite sector specific as well, looking at the private security industry and certification components as well, and unpacking what that looks like. And now in sort of your more recent venture, you're looking at sort of the investor side of the house, which has been, I think, identified also in the UNGP's report on the important role that the financial sector potentially could play, but also the gaps in that regard. So for you, fairly sort of general questions, but no doubt let you sort of pick and choose where you want to focus. Challenges and opportunities of an integrated approach, any reflections that you may have on so-called certification without breaking it down to too much of a sort of the details to what processes look at. And then maybe we could touch upon the role that the investor community may have beyond the supply chain, but nonetheless, it's seemingly a growing, I think, focus on what those with the money as such have in terms of role that they can play and influence they can play in this regard. Rebecca, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Jamie, and thanks for inviting me and to all the previous speakers for their useful contributions. I just can only build on what was already said, and congratulations on the HRIA guidance. I'm very excited to see that out. It's something I had hoped to see for quite some time since the association was formed. So it's timely, and as Anita's already pointed out, it's a great complement to that wonderful guidance you've already produced on grievance mechanisms. So I encourage all companies, not just private security companies, to take a look because these are useful tools, also sector specific but useful across sectors. So I want to start off just briefly by touching on this idea of an integrated approach to impact assessment. It's something Giuseppe spoke to, and it's also discussed in the guidance. And really, I think specific to the security industry, what we mean with an integrated approach is using existing enterprise risk management processes to address assessing and addressing human rights risks and impacts. So something that John spoke to already, something that companies do before they begin new projects or programs, and something they do as well on an ongoing basis. And the UNGPs, you know, as been said, certainly recognizes the possibility and frankly the practicality of an integrated approach to identifying human rights risks and impacts, but with two important stipulations. One of them Giuseppe already mentioned is that companies must go beyond simply identifying and managing material risks to the company itself, which is the traditional lens through which enterprise risk management is done, and instead also assess and address the quote unquote salient risks to rights holders, all right? The second stipulation in the guiding principles is that when taking enterprise risk management approach to human rights impact assessment is that the starting point be all internationally recognized human rights. And this is important because companies can impact on any number of human rights. Now, while I was preparing for today, I ran across a really great blog post by a Shift staffer, Francis West. It was entitled "The Quiet Radicalism of the Responsibility to Respect." And it really made me pause for a minute to think about what this means to speak about assessing and addressing salient risks to rights holders. And I quote him, he says, "Transforming a business to focus on risks to people's human rights and not just risks to the business remains arguably the single most radical idea within the guiding principles. Yet it is still the hardest thing for businesses to embrace to its full extent." And he goes on to say basically that identifying this lens of risk to people requires a rethinking of various processes, requires a scrutinization of business models and strategies, requires building empathetic leadership in the company, as well as a more open and reflective corporate culture. So, and the reason I raise this and quote Francis West here is because I think really for an effective integrated approach to human rights impact assessment, it's not enough to take your standard enterprise risk management process and tack on, frankly, a handful of human rights considerations. Instead, there really needs to be a shift in corporate culture, one that really seeks to embed human rights into the DNA of the corporate culture. Why is this important? Because otherwise there's a danger that human rights risks that are not associated with business risks will go unassessed and unaddressed. A lot of the standard enterprise risk management processes tend to focus on the likelihood of a risk occurring rather than focusing to severity of a possible impact on people as a basis for prioritizing risks. Companies often have a very different level of risk tolerance than frankly impacted people do, right? And then there's this whole issue of human rights expertise of risk management, something that's already been touched on. So generally, there's an inherent risk there in and of itself of using an enterprise risk management approach as a model for addressing human rights risks and impacts, but it's something that can happen and can be done well. And I'll get to that in a second. I'm going to use this as an opportunity to segue a little bit about the dangers of an audit culture, a kind of compliance culture that often goes hand in hand with taking this enterprise risk management approach, because a lot of companies rely on audits and certifications as a cornerstone of addressing enterprise risks. Here too, and I don't want to spend too much time on this because time's short, we want to leave some time for Q&A, but really this idea of of using certification and audits, which is at the core of a lot of multi-stakeholder issues like the Code of Conduct Association, is that there's been a pretty poor track record in terms of using social auditing to identify and address human rights abuses. And there's a number of reasons. I don't want to go into all of them, everything from the problems associated with a tick the box exercise, with having, audits that were reflective of a snapshot in time, with a failure to undertake root cause analyses, focusing more to short-term thinking and passing audits, quite frankly, to more of a focus on process rather than human rights outcomes. The problems are there, and I would encourage people to go to the Business and Human Rights Resource Center's website called Beyond Social Auditing, which addresses some of this. That said, taking this integrated approach, using certification as one of the foundations for assessing enterprise risk can be done well. And I think with this guidance, we see a step in terms of how the security sector can do it well, right? And there's still much to be done, and GSFP has outlined some of the ways forward. There needs to be pilot projects of this guidance. There needs to be, a sharing fora where companies come together and talk about what they've done and openly about the challenges they face. There need to be really efforts to ensure that this kind of corporate culture is established, that tone is set from the top, so that addressing human rights risks is really a top strategic priority of the company that really is, weaved throughout a holistic risk management process. So there's challenges, but there's a lot of possibilities as well in terms of doing it right. Foremost, I would also say I would encourage the security companies that are members of ICoCA, as well as their stakeholders, to actually actively support mandated human rights due diligence. Why? Because it will help create a level playing field. It will contribute to harmonization and standardization of due diligence good practice, which frankly makes your job easier. So I would note that with regards to the policy developments. And then finally, very, very briefly, maybe we can talk about this more in the Q&A. This is obviously an issue that is very important to investors as well. First of all, as John mentioned, this past proxy season was amazing in terms of the clear indication that there is a growing swath of investors who are very interested in ESG, environmental, social, and governance factors in terms of how they invest. And just judging by the membership of the Investor Alliance, this is a big concern, right? There's a growing awareness around the risks related to investments in companies operating in conflict-affected and high-risk areas. Investors are increasingly demanding of their portfolio companies that they evidence enhanced or heightened due diligence processes to identify how they might be causing, contributing, or linked to human rights harms, to demonstrate what they're doing to prevent, mitigate, remediate those harms, or if unfortunately sometimes necessary, to frankly divest from certain situations where they aren't able to address those harms. I don't have time to go into details of Investor Alliance work, but we have members who are working around assessing their companies and pushing their companies to do their own assessments of their business activities in areas like the Uyghur region in China, such as in Myanmar and other high-risk areas. So this is something very much the forefront of investors' minds, and therefore I would think also at the forefront of a number of companies' minds that are in these operating environments, complex operating environments. And I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, Rebecca. And there's a lot there likewise in terms of the culture, the top-down, ensuring that audits aren't simply the tick the box exercise, and then a growing influence on the investor side of the house as well. And to note, of course, we'll hopefully come back to that as well. The UNGPs report does speak to that, and also identifies gaps in the whole ESG reporting world as well. We're about 15-20 minutes or thereabouts ahead of us. So rather than try and sort of direct questions specifically to anyone, just again, if there's any participant who wants to add any questions, please do so in the Q&A. We'll answer those that we can online, but the others which I think merit further discussion will be addressed locally. There's one which is being termed as a comment rather than a question, but I actually think it's a comment which is worth a discussion nonetheless. The question of the UNGPs being quite international, and then the challenges that we see in terms of the localization. Now, how do we take what predominantly is an international kind of approach? If you look at the 25 national action plans regionally, It's not necessarily in most complex environments. So how do we take the UNGPs and actually address them at a local level in complex environments where the local authorities, governments, and the business community may not necessarily be au fait when it comes to the UNGPs, may not necessarily understand that there's international code of conduct out there. How do we overcome that? Because it could be seen as simply the UNGPs are nice for the Western world, but when we're looking at complex environments, they are of not much value actually. In actual fact, they should be of more of an impact in those environments than elsewhere. I don't know. I'll put it maybe to Anita, Dorothy, and John as you wish, because I think there's a lot in that particular comment you may want to look at.
Yeah, no, there is a lot. I'll just be very brief to say, and Jamie, you mentioned national action plans. The whole focus of the working group has been taking what was a Geneva-centered approach and bringing it out into a much more local context. That can be achieved through national action plans. It can be achieved actually through regional processes. So we've done a lot of work in South Asia, in Latin America, in Asia, even in the Pacific, really to bring business and human rights down to a much more regional and then national and local level through, again, peer learning, engagement of civil society, companies, and governments around the context that is very much local. So I think it's about saying, yes, the guiding principles are going to look different in terms of what commitments and priorities are going to be in these different contexts. So that is critical to this endeavor. We're also fortunate through our work to go and actually go on country visits to work very much in specific local contexts and to continue our partnerships with governments and other actors in those local contexts as we move forward. So all of that is helpful as a starting point. And again, I think commitments and sort of peer learning at that local level is going to be critical as we move forward. But at the same time, I think the question and comment also, the beauty of multilateralism is, right, that it does create expectations and common denominators among states as well. So in terms of how you use levers like trade and investment to assure, again, common baselines. I mean, the guiding principles at the end of the day are about really saying we're committed to, doing no harm to people who may be impacted by business activity. And its broadest contour, that's very hard to disagree with. How we do it, we may need to figure out. So I'll stop there.
Thanks. John?
Maybe a brief comment. So one of the reasons I really like the guiding principles is that it's brilliantly written. And also because they are principles. So they're not actually that difficult to explain. If you talk about principles, impact, doing no harm, treating people decently, that actually comes to a question about how do you explain this at the very local level. Maybe 2 points about that. Even at the very local level, in our experience, people actually are quite interested in the fact that there is an international framework. They want to know where it comes from, what it's all about. They don't have to be human rights legal experts. So 2 things on that. I don't want to downplay their interest in all the human rights paraphernalia that interest us. That interest does exist, but the most important thing is, what do you do? And the way that we play that would be running through scenarios, running through dilemmas, because there often are dilemmas, and that's the way of engaging things, engaging people. So we can make this terribly abstract and complicated, and we can write lots of books like the books behind me, but we don't need to do that. It's not that difficult to communicate, especially in quite tough places.
Thanks, John. Dorothy, do you want to add a couple of things here?
Very briefly, I was really fascinated by your comments, John. It's encouraging to hear that you think they can be translated, yet I suppose you still want a level playing field, even in those toughest places in the world. And so then the devil is in the detail, namely in the implementation. How are those high-level code elements broken down into concrete behavioral conduct expectations? And I think that needs to be harmonized. And that's why in my remarks, I really highlighted that whatever indicators are currently being developed, they need to be tested in the field to adapt them to those local contexts if necessary. So while the UN guiding principles continue radiating, I think at government levels, I think for companies, the question how to make them real in very concrete contexts, it's on top of their agenda. So, and I'm not sure if it's helpful to say, the UN guiding principles will make their way eventually. I mean, often in those contexts, there's no pillar one. The government does not protect human rights. It's actually part of the problem. So how should then companies behave in such contexts? It's something that I think can be best clarified on an industry level, on a multi-stakeholder platform, and we need to talk about that. I don't think companies should one by one define, what they're doing. They're not on an individual journey. It's about defining a level playing field.
So it's about all these things. One thing I quite often find myself saying, thank you for raising pillar one. We shouldn't forget it. The guiding principles is designed to address a governance gap, but we shouldn't forget that the governance gap needs to be filled by governments primarily. I guess my main point was about communication, and I'm thinking about this very because I'm thinking about what kind of recommendations do we make about training for ourselves, for our own people. Jamie made a point about nationalization, so local employees. What do they need to know? They don't necessarily need to know where Geneva is. They need to know what they do in certain circumstances. But by the way, they do like to know where Geneva is. They do like to know that there is a wider story there. So I'm a little bit hopeful that communication is possible. I guess on the governance gap, there's a whole issue about how you deal with governments, abusive government, abusive local government agencies. That's really tough, and there you need a lot of allies. That's also where Western governments, local representation may be helpful. Multilateral agencies may be helpful. The business case, we're always talking about the business case. What is the business case to governments? So you need multiple strands for making this. What the business case for governments means, why does it help you to do this? Not you must do this because some other people say you must do it. Why does it actually help you? What are the benefits?
Okay, if I sort of steer in that conversation, taking the government's piece, and again, this is open, sort of comment as well. Multinational corporations, they I think are the ones that are sort of pointed at in terms of responsibilities as corporate actors as major clients. And then there's potential leverage points for multinational clients. They have a major impact in these complex environments. And I think many of the national drives in terms of national legislation or human rights due diligence is trying to focus on that. And we saw this in Switzerland as well recently, last year with a referendum. But we've also seen in many contexts, Mozambique and a number of others, the role that multinationals can play and the gaps that they also leave behind in terms of implementation of the UN guiding principles. Looking at, I think, maybe Rebecca and potentially at Giuseppe a little bit, and of course, Dorothee, because you work on corporate governance, how do we then put the pressure points on the multinationals themselves as the clients, as the security providers, users in many contexts? And Rebecca, maybe from your perspective, as you've come across different vantage points over the past few years.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I mean, I think certainly, one of the ways to put pressures on the multinational themselves is certainly through, through legislative and regulatory processes, obviously. I mean, I can't stress enough, I think, what promise it holds to see that there may be mandated human rights due diligence soon at the EU level. And certainly there's been progress made just, was a week before last in terms of mandated due diligence laws being passed in Germany as well as Norway. So those, I think, are really one ways for, recognizing that we need that quote unquote smart mix of both voluntary measures, encouraging companies via codes like this one and guidance like the one that was just put out, but also, policy progress as well. And I think also investors, as I said before, have a very important role to play, to use the fact that they're shareholders in these companies to put pressure on them to do their own due diligence of their security providers, due diligence on their supply chains. And I think really there's probably still room for improvement. I think that came out in the UN Working Group's report that Anita had an instrumental role in writing, is that we need to really think about when we speak of heightened or enhanced due diligence, what exactly does that mean? And I think there are certainly some limitations in terms of what companies can possibly do. And we see that with our investors in terms of the discussions we've had with our members about what to do with regards to the Uyghur region or the current situation in Myanmar, because there's not an easy solution, in particular when governments, as I said earlier, when governments play such an active hand in those abuses. So I think in that case, getting back to something that Dorothy said, we really need to think about action on multiple levels. It's not enough for companies to do something, it's not enough for governments to do something. We need action at the national levels, at the international multilateral levels as well, involving private and public sector actors.
And Dorothea, on that, if I may quickly, looking at corporate governance, we have seen, I think, an increase in the discussion in terms of the responsibilities of the board of directors, for instance. And it's good to have, let's say, policies being pushed out. But is that enough? Are we seeing a pickup by multinationals and others, at least at the governance level of boards, to take the UNGP responsibilities seriously?
Jerry, I think the awareness is raising because of, and Rebecca will do this better, because of ESG, because of environmental, social, governance data that investors request, and that reaches the board level. And so providing information on those aspects of the firm requires experts also at the senior management level. And I would love to see more human rights experts being integrated at this level, because it's expertise that is relevant for the business. And I mean, we're centers at business schools, so we also don't shy away from making the business case. There's human rights have a strong normative value, so there's no need for the business case, but to talk to companies and convince them that they should take this on, anticipate those risks, and actually address them before they blow out of proportion is just better business. It's better business to anticipate what might happen and ensure that community relations are good, etc. Unless you have to manage conflict between, for example, security providers and the communities, and that's messy, that's costly in the end. And yeah, in terms of governance, I really think that topic is being driven by investors for a demand of ESG. And for me, human rights are part of the S in ESG, something that needs to be defined further in concrete terms.
Perfect. I have John with one finger up. I'll take John, and I'll go to Giuseppe fairly quickly in a second. But John, go for it.
Okay, a very quick point. When your question was building up, you were talking about multinationals, and I thought you were then going to talk about local companies, and you didn't. So let me.
I was going to get to that exactly. So before you got, there is a question of local companies, and I'll also have Giuseppe jump in as well to speak about that translation of our work vis-a-vis local security providers, and how do you unpack these broader principles at the localized level. But John, go with that one finger first.
Okay, I'll go with the one finger. Multinational companies, there are various levels of accountability. They may be imperfect, but they're there. For local, which also means regional companies, so companies from Thailand and Myanmar or whatever, that's much more difficult. Some ways forward. The international companies have influence. Local business associations have influence. And then you need to think about the whole economy. So it's not about individual companies in isolation. This is holistic again. You need to think about war economies and how war economies become the kind of economy. And for that, you really need the local businesses and the regional ones.
And can I just do 10 seconds to just add to John's point? Yeah, which is that that smaller companies in these regional environments often are the ones that are suffering in terms of a lot of issues around corruption, if you're talking about war economies. So making champions out of them, but also working with ministries that have the remit for SMEs has been another really successful way to partner and to sort of move the agenda forward at that very local level.
Perfect. So we are seeing a localization, despite, I think, our discussions on the multinational responsibilities. So Giuseppe, on the very practical operationalization piece, how do you translate these principles, the human rights impact assessment, the guidance, to that local level? Because your work is day-to-day working with local security providers.
Yes, thanks, Jamie. I believe we can learn from what we have been doing over the past few years on protection from sexual exploitation and abuse, which is at the moment when we released the guidelines, we saw that there was interest in the topic, but most of the companies failed to understand the full extent of expectations and requirements in terms of PSEA. So what has been useful for us has been engaging bilaterally with companies, having bilateral conversations, and then bringing these bilateral conversations into a broader context, allowing companies to share experiences. But sometimes when capacities are lacking, you really need to sit down with companies and even explain exactly what are the expectations, what would the association require from members and affiliates. So I think this might be a practical exercise for us as well.
Thanks, Giuseppe. And it's all about, I think, confidence building as well, because it's nice for us to cite to guiding principles and guidance, but it's actually given the confidence to those that have to apply those sort of human rights principles in country to want to learn and to actually recognize that they have the capacity to do so. I know we're 1 hour in already, and I gather we only have about 1 hour thereabouts to get through what was quite a lot of material. So maybe I'm just going to turn to each of you for very last sort of, either comment or question. We've just done a 10-year stock taking. 10 years from now, how would you like to see the narrative? Where would you like to see the biggest change? So maybe Anita, I know it's a tough question. Maybe you have an answer already.
I have one, which is, I mean, Doro mentioned, that at the end of the day, it's going to be often much more costlier to deal with conflict than to actually try to prevent and mitigate human rights abuses. Along those same lines, I think for all of us, we think we know what human rights due diligence is from our vantage point in Geneva or wherever we are. Very often it's because of the lack of engagement and proper consultation at the start to understand the context from the views of people on the ground. And if we did that first, I think that would be the greatest step we could take towards a much more effective impact and due diligence system.
View from the ground. Super. Thank you. Dorothy?
Sure. I mean, I hope that the UN guiding principles are being broken down into industry-specific human rights standards that concretely clarify the expectations so that companies actually know what they're signing up for. I think ICoCA is a model platform to develop what human rights due diligence in the private security sector should mean. I hope that this is happening in the next 10 years, because that would make human rights due diligence concretely actionable, measurable. We could compare companies' performance across the industry, but also over time. Just last, I'm going to pick up the question from Gabrielle, who says, well, what if it's less costly to abuse human rights than to respect human rights? I love it because it's provocative. I would say, given how transparent and interconnected our world is, companies that play that card, they sit on a ticking time bomb. It's something that I wouldn't bet on if I want a sustainable business.
Thanks, Dorothy. John, from your perspective?
Okay, so continuing from the earlier thoughts, I'm hoping for heightened due diligence. And what I mean by that is a broader sectoral approach and particular conflict risk assessment. So this is not a new idea. We've had do no harm 20 years ago. That's 20 years ago, not 10 years ago. That needs to be much more deeply embedded. For that to happen, again, it can't be companies in isolation. It needs to be companies working with other companies. And what about the local companies? It's something we really need to build on, building broader economies, not just companies from Geneva acting in isolation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, John. Giuseppe?
Yes, Jamie. Well, I think it was already said and pretty much well covered. From my side, I just wanted to thank companies because of their involvement. Not all of them have been represented in this webinar, but thank them for the continued engagement, and I hope that we will continue to receive feedback as we are receiving at the moment on our tools.
Thank you very much, Giuseppe. And last but not least, Rebecca, you've been
two
following
quick
this
things.
for a while. So, yep.
Great. Two quick things. I can't add more than other than agreeing that it's extremely important that there be some type of pilot project of this. ICoCA is well positioned. You have good ties to NGOs. You can bring in that local voice, try to figure out how to assess impact on the ground, move away from process to the actual impacts on people. So let's just do that first. And then second, I would just also, I would build on something that Dorothee just said. I think it's it's very important to make the business business case, and certainly one that's very central for investors. I think that we all should not fear to also recognize that there is a value in of itself of just respecting human rights. So.
Thank you very much. That was, I mean, fascinating. As the hour flew by, we should have actually scheduled an hour and a half, I dare say. I'll just note, it's been 10 years. We've gone a long way. I think we still have a long way to go, I dare say, in a positive note, but at least we're unpacking many of the issues. I certainly take note of the fact that we need a sector-specific approach to unpack many of the UN guiding principles, and the work of the association has been recognized in that perspective. But we must be working in silos, naturally, because there are supply chain issues and different stakeholder groups that have to be involved. And I will note that all of you speak about the impact. So questions of audit, verification, monitoring, assessments have to be properly carried out and fully addressed. But last but not least, I think that kind of localization point that you each made, the stakeholders being affected by the malpractices of the industry and others, I think are the most important, and those that have to be heard, both in terms of grievances, remedy, but also prevention in many senses. I'll stop here. We've overshot the hour, so thank you very much to my great panelists. It's good to see you all again, and hopefully we'll all meet in person in not too distant future. And again, of course, congratulations one to Anita for the UNGP's 10th anniversary, and I also say congratulations to Giuseppe for the publication of the HRIA guidance on behalf of ICoCA. So thank you, everyone. Participants, any questions we haven't addressed, we'll hopefully get to you in writing in due course. Thank you very much. That's all for me, and I wish you all a great afternoon.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.